Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and it is my pleasure today to host our symposium on the Qoshtepa Canal, its implications for water and security in Afghanistan and Central Asia. Without further ado, I will turn first to our senior fellow, Andy Kuchins. Andy, please take it away.
Thanks, Jacob. Thank you very much for hosting our discussion this morning, and thanks to Paul Saunders, the president of the Center for the National Interest, for supporting this project, and thanks very much to my co-authors, Elvira Aidarhanova and Najibullah Sadid, who are with us this morning, and also Zakria Barazkai. You know, it really goes back to discussions with Zakria in the almost a year ago, and he started talking to me about this the canal project, and I was really struck by what seemed to be the great significance of this for a lot of reasons in Afghanistan and Central Asia, and thus we began to embark on a report on it. It took a bit longer than expected, but here it is. We're glad to see it out in the light of day. So the Qoshtepa Canal, currently under construction in Afghanistan on the Amu Darya River, is going to really dramatically affect availability of water for irrigation and drinking in one of the world's most water-scarce regions, Central Asia. In addition to their already existing water challenges, the Amu Darya Basin and Central Asia are experiencing a far more rapid rate of climate change than the global average. The interim authorities, or de facto authorities of Afghanistan, face major financial, technical, and diplomatic challenges to complete the canal in an efficient, sustainable, and peaceful manner. The region really cannot afford for this canal to be as poorly designed and constructed as Soviet canals on the Amu Darya River, which decades after their construction continued to impinge on regional water security. The Soviet historical legacy also excludes Afghanistan from essential water sharing agreements. It is urgent, in our view, that Washington and multilateral development institutions engage with Afghanistan and its neighbors to view the Qoshtepa Canal in the broader geographical and historical context of the Amu Darya River Basin and take action on this basis. This is going to require U.S. leadership to adjust its current approach of isolating Afghanistan. Despite the attendant challenges, and there are many, the canal project represents an extraordinary opportunity for Washington to contribute to a more positive legacy of regional development and peaceful cooperation. U.S. engagement could also offer Washington greater influence in a region that is, of course, dominated by Russia and Central Asia. The canal itself is by far, I think, the largest development project undertaken in the history of Afghanistan. Of course, for the previous 45 years since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, until the Taliban were taken out in 2001, there was very little done in development. This project itself has a history that goes back, its consideration even back to the 1950s. And it is the interim authorities, the Taliban's hope that their ability to manage a large infrastructure project that will greatly reduce poverty, increase arable agricultural land, and enhance food security. The planned canal is 287 kilometers long, 8.5 meters deep, with an average of 100 meters width. That's 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It is expected to open more than 1.2 million acres of farmland and create 200,000 jobs. And current construction is involving about 5,000 workers, 4,000 trucks and earth movers. And is progressing fairly rapidly, maybe not as rapidly as it was in its first phase. It's now late in the second phase. Most reports speak of a 6-year timetable for canal creation, but the overall project, all the branch, secondary, tertiary, and distributive canals, and the water regulatory distributory structures required for actual irrigation is going to take actually significantly longer to complete, which I think is a good thing, and we'll return to that later. In many ways, the Qoshtepa Canal represents for Afghanistan's de facto authorities a bold new vision for a peaceful, verdant, prosperous, and self-sufficient country. Of course, the Taliban were not the first to explore this project, but they have enthusiastically embraced it. The canal represents part of the Taliban's political effort to build support from the population. However, given the current isolation of the interim authorities of Afghanistan, it is extremely unlikely that the canal will be constructed in a reasonably sustainable fashion, or that conflict between Afghanistan and its downstream neighbors, notably Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, will be satisfactorily resolved without such assistance. Okay, let's turn to a little geography, provide some geographical context for the Qoshtepa Canal. So this map does provide some relief. The Amu Darya River originates in the Hindu Kush and Wakhan regions in the Pamir highlands of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So that's the mountainous area to the right side, the southeast side of the map. The basin itself is located downstream in the vicinity of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And you can see how large the Amu Darya River is. It was often referred to as the Nile of Central Asia. Now, where it finishes, the RLC, well, that's not an accurate depiction of the RLC today. There is very little left, actually, of the RLC, and we'll get more into that. Before the near disappearance of the RLC over the last 60 years, the Amu Darya rivers did flow there, where the river came to an end. Now that flow is barely a trickle when it reaches old RLC territory. You can see in lighter print, there's Afghanistan down to this south center of the map, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan to the east, and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan kind of on both sides of the river itself. Let's go to the second map that is, I think, more interesting. This is a schematic map of the Amu Darya that shows the starting point of the Qoshtepa Canal, which is a dotted red line in the south center of the map. And it also indicated is the land that it would bring, the land that would be arable with its water for irrigation. And it also this map also, of course, indicates the major Soviet-era canals in the region, notably the Karakum Canal, which comes off the Amu Darya River a bit to the north and goes directly west into Turkmenistan, and you can see the capital of Turkmenistan there, and further west, which is very close to the Iranian border. The start of the main canal is located near nearly at the peak flow point of water, which is indicated by the width of the river there. In addition, the map indicates the shrinkage of the RLC, and this is the much more accurate depiction of the RLC, and even this is from more than 10 years ago. But you can see that there is now a South RLC, a seasonal lake, and the Northern RLC, and the vast majority of the RLC is no longer with us. Let's turn to the third of the maps. Now, the three northern provinces where the Qoshtepa Canal will transport Amu Darya rivers to previously non-arable land for irrigated land are Balkh, Jawzjan, and Faryab. And this is a very strategically important region in northern Afghanistan, as the population is not so large, about 3.3 million out of a total of approximately 43 million in the country, but it's home to significant minority ethnic groups, including Tajiks, Uzbeks, Sunni Hazaras, and others. And they have presented to Kabul significant governance challenges for many governments in Kabul over the decades. In the late 1990s, this was the base for much of the Northern Alliance, which supported the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, in bringing down the Taliban government in the fall of 2001. Northern Afghanistan, and especially the area a bit north of the first intake, point of the planned canal route on the very porous Afghan-Tajik border has served as a haven for ISK, Islamic State Khorasan, and other transboundary terrorist groups. So I think that you can understand in particular why the authorities in Kabul would like to see significant socioeconomic development in this part of the country to perhaps alleviate some of the anti-government feelings. All right, let's turn to our next speaker.
Our next speaker will be a research associate at the Center for the National Interest, Elvira Aydarkhanova. Elvira, please give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Jacob. Good morning, everybody. It is great to be here today. It's a true pleasure to be speaking on the topics that not only holds profound historical significance, but also continue to influence the environmental policy and water resource management across Central Asia. From here, let me share my presentation. I'd like to talk about Soviet-era canal projects in Central Asia now, and then I'll discuss the Qoshtepa Canal construction's impact on regional water security. I'll also briefly explore how Central Asian states manage their water resources today and highlight factors that could lead up to water challenges in the region. And if time allows, I'll touch on some legal issues around water use in Central Asia and Afghanistan. So before I delve into my main argument, I'd like to underscore the importance of the Qoshtepa Canal construction for Afghanistan and make it clear that this canal construction is truly symbolizes a promising future for Afghan nation, and which is struggling with severe humanitarian crisis today. However, there are some serious concerns that Qoshtepa Canal is being built without, proper technical and economic support, relying on outdated construction methods and driven only by political goals. Because we know that history provides a clear example of taking this path. So here I'd like to highlight the example of Soviet irrigation projects, especially Karakum Canal in present-day Turkmenistan. So we know that over 20 years between 1960s to 1980s, the Soviet Union invested billions of rubles in irrigation infrastructure, constructing over 170,000 kilometers of canals across Central Asia to irrigate land. In the 1970s, nearly all of the cultivable land in Soviet Uzbekistan was converted for cotton cultivation, and by early 1980s, Soviet Union was producing 9 million tons of cotton. And yes, this whole thing made the Soviet Union the fourth largest producer of the cotton globally. But this ambitions came at a very devastating cost, very devastating price. And I think the construction of the Karakum Canal is a perfect example of illustrating the risks of prioritizing speed, cost efficiency, and political will over environmental safety. So I won't delve too deep into its history, but I want to underscore key moments that can be compared to construction of Qoshtepa Canal today, and encourage the audience to reflect on these parallels. So the construction of the Qoshtepa Canal construction of the Karakum Canal was implemented under Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of Community Party back then. Canal construction was pushed through with remarkable speed as part of Khrushchev's agriculture reform in 1960s. The main purpose of the canal project was to transform Soviet Central Asia into cotton monoculture. This phenomenon also called cotton curse in many studies. In a rush to meet the targets of Soviet Union's 7-year plan, the construction of the Karakum Canal moved at an extremely fast pace. For example, the second stage of the Karakum Canal construction was originally intended to take 5 years, but under Khrushchev's push for rapid results, it completed just in 2 years. And this urgency, of course, came with a price. So when the first phase of the Karakum Canal was launched in 1959, the RLC already been shrinking dramatically. And by the time the Karakum Canal reached the final stages, it was in 1988, the Amu Darya River no longer reached RLC. So from this screenshot, you can see the transformation of the RLC from a vast inland body water into a barren desert. Today, we face the fact that 90% of the RLC's territory is gone, and Central Asia faces chronic water crisis that continues to affect the millions of people living in Central Asia. And in this presentation, I aim to highlight a comparison between the construction of Qoshtepa Canal today and the Karakum Canal back then. The construction methods of these canals are kind of similar, not quite same, but kind of similar. So both relied on basic techniques that prioritized speed and cost over proper engineering. Karakum Canal's construction was marked by the use of popular Soviet-era people's construction method, Народная стройка, which focused in rapid progress, with minimal attention to engineering quality. And the canal banks were poorly reinforced using cheap materials like clay and sand. And as a result, the significant seepage occurred today, worsening soil salinization and around the surrounding the area. Similarly, construction of the Qoshtepa Canal today utilized rudimentary methods. There was a minimal reinforcement and insufficient lining on the canal's banks, and which I assume Najib will address more in detail later. So these risks repeating, at least when you look at the similarities, how these canals are being built, the same rough mistakes made back then in the past, and the left negative impacts on the region. And this includes cotton farming in Central Asia that limits economic diversification in Uzbekistan, especially. And these canals were built decades apart, but they kind of show the focus on cutting costs over proper engineering. So today, the Karakum Canal is one of the largest irrigation projects of the globe, and the main focus of the fresh water in current-day Turkmenistan. And we're here talking about the country where 80% of the land is desert, and yet it uses over 15,000 liters of water per person daily, mostly through the Karakum Canal to irrigate over millions hectares of land. And this is the highest indicator of the water usage according to real-time statistics. This highlights the urgent need for the water reform in Central Asia and sustainable practices. So, damage done is very severe. Now, a large portion of irrigated land in Turkmenistan is affected by high soil salinization, and that has also worsened over time and created a cycle of ecological damage that harms the region's agriculture. So the soil salinization is not only the problem of Turkmenistan, it's the problem of the whole entire region, the Central Asia. During this report research, we found many studies showing that salts carried by wind and the water flow into neighboring countries such as Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, worsening environmental damage. So here is from this screen, you can see the actual Karakum Canal. So I just want to very briefly, this presentation shows the usage in current Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, with the majority used for irrigation. Just last year, Uzbekistan produced an impressive 3.7 million tons of cotton. This highlights the vast scale of the cotton production in Uzbekistan and underscores the serious concern regarding the huge amount of water it requires each year for this cotton monoculture. So I would probably switch to the legal issues of the Qoshtepa Canal, as I don't know if I have enough time to share more on the water issues. So this presentation is about legal frameworks of Qoshtepa Canal and the Amudarya Basin faces today. The Qoshtepa Canal faces challenges due to the lack of clear legal frameworks or the water use, and these frameworks are essential for managing water withdrawals in the river systems between the countries sharing the Amudarya. And Afghanistan is not part of the first. Afghanistan is not part of UN transboundary water from 1992, which outlines how shared water resources should be managed. And this means that Afghanistan basically is building the canal without following these international guidelines. So I think the situation, I would say, would basically raises concern about potential conflicts over the water rights between these countries or in the region. This situation highlights the need for regional cooperation and the managing shared water resources. Also, there is a very crucial issue that there is no agreement between Afghanistan and the Central Asian states that to use of Amudarya's water. Afghanistan was basically excluded from the 1992 Almaty Agreement, which includes 5 Central Asian states, and this shows that gap in regional water management and highlights the need for inclusive discussions to manage shared transboundary resources. We know that recently Afghanistan and Turkmenistan formed this joint commission to address issues around the canal, but it was announced by the Uzbek government that third meeting will take place in Tashkent. We don't know the date yet, but the interesting fact about this joint meeting is that Turkmenistan was not a participant of these talks, and this raises concern about the effectiveness of any agreements between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. So today, Amudarya River is essential to Central Asia and provides about 80% of the region's water, primarily for agriculture and cotton farming. And as we see, the legacy of Soviet projects persists to this day. What was, I would say, once was ambitious vision of transforming Central Asia into agricultural powerhouse. Instead, it turned into the region where it has huge problems. Water scarcity, poor soil quality, and shrinking water bodies. And it worsened by outdated infrastructure, over utilization of shared water resources, and so on. So, plus we know that the construction of the Qoshtepa Canal is on the agenda today, and that's another kind of problem. So concluding, I think the message is here clear that, without proper international support, both financial and technical, and a mutual framework between these countries, this may end up worsening water scarcity in Central Asia. Thank you.
Well, that was not an uplifting report, but an extremely detailed and gloomy assessment. Thank you very much. We now turn to our third discussant, Najibullah Sadid, who is talking to us, I think, from Germany in the Rhineland-Pfalz, or the Rhineland-Palatinate, where he is working for the state government on environmental affairs. Please tell us your assessment of this project.
Thank you, Jacob. It's my pleasure to be here and to have contributed to this report. Let me share some slides. So I will be talking more or focusing on the what would be the outcome of the poor quality construction work which is going on, and what is the current quality of the canal, and what would be the environmental, technical, and agricultural challenges in the future based on the current progress of the canal. So this is an image of the canal from the first phase. You see that canal is basically dug in a desert area dominated by sand dunes and very sandy soil. So based on the feasibility study, the sandy soil is not very suitable for the canals because it leads to the wastage of water due to infiltration. That's one side of the story, that you waste water basically on the way before it reaches to the agricultural field. But on the other hand, of course, the wasted water, the infiltrated water will push up the groundwater levels, and that groundwater, of course, pushes through the soil particles. And the soil is, of course, very saline and alkaline in this region because North Afghanistan is an evaporative region, because this Balkhab River is basically opening up from the mountainous region into the flat plain of the northern Afghanistan, and basically it deposits all the sediments and salt particles which washes away through the valley of Balkhab. And that is where the soil is becoming very salty in this region due to the evaporation, a large rate of evaporation that leaves behind the salt particles. That's where the soil becomes very salty, and due to the river flow, which has brought a lot of sediments here, the soil is also very, very sandy. So based on the feasibility study report, which is very, very rough, it only encompasses the 40 kilometer that will lose for 22% of the total water which will flow into the canal. So 22% is a huge, and it only assumes that 40 kilometer of the canal would be dug in a very sandy soil. But we see that images are emerging that the whole first phase up to 108 kilometer is basically very sandy. That means that the actual soil water loss would be much higher than 22%, which is estimated in the feasibility study. So this is one aspect that the canal, the current construction can lead to the water wastage and soil salinization, at least in the first phase. As I said, the canal is basically constructed in 2024, now modern era, but the method is basically Soviet era construction method. There is no lining of the canal. There is no geotextile, which we know from the modern era that when canal is dug into such a soil that, of course, you cover the canal with a geotextile and then cover the geotextile with a concrete layer, so that, of course, you avoid water wastage on the way before water reaches the agriculture area. So this wanted to show the first one. And maybe to come back to the issue of salinization. Salinization is a major issue. In this map, you see the whole Central Asia. There has been, of course, efforts to combat salinization. Salinization is that when you dug canals in a very loose soil, that, as I said, they pushes the salt particles into the surface. And when the surface, it's 1 meter from the surface, this is the topsoil, it is relevant for agriculture. Because when the salt particles are pushed into the surface, then of course that damages the soil in the topsoil, and that of course deteriorates the agricultural productivity. And this is what has happened in Central Asia. You see that even due to the efforts of international efforts, these countries' efforts to build drainage canals to find a way for the rest water which is coming from agriculture to be deposited to be guided out of the agricultural area. Even due to these all efforts, we see 7% increase from 1990 to 2018 in soil salinity across Central Asia. For example, in Uzbekistan, we have reports that, of course, there has been efforts to combat soil salinity, but the amount of water which is saved due to improved, for example, cropping, more agricultural land is developed instead of basically leaving some water for the environment. So this is one why the international efforts also somehow has not led to the revival of, for example, the RLC when we talk about more environmentally flow to the RLC. So this is what also awaits Afghanistan in the near future when the canal becomes operational, when there is water in the canal. That will also appear. A lot of region would be very salty, and in particular regions where from topography it's located lower, so that the water basically accumulates and exfiltrates into the surface from the canal bed, and the regions where the soil is very, very sandy, that will for sure happen. And of course, these soil particles is not remaining, as Elvira already mentioned. This is not remaining in one region. You see this satellite images from North Afghanistan. You can also see Karakum Canal here, the reservoir which is built there, and this is the Amudarya. You see that this region is basically a low pressure region, and the high pressure in Turkmenistan is also causing very intense winds in the summertime and the late summertime. And that blows a lot of sand from across the region, but also across Turkmenistan into Afghanistan, but also from Afghanistan back into Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, and even across the Hindu Kush into Kabul and Peshawar. So these all particles are not remaining there, the salt particles. They are basically impacting the agriculture across the northern valley of Amudarya, but also impacting, of course, glaciers, because salt particles, when they land on the glaciers, they are also contributing to the glacier melt across the Central Asia and over the Pamir and Hindu Kush mountains. And as I said, it's happening on regular basis, becoming like two times per week we see this sort of dust storms. And the dust storms is not only about basically carrying salt particles, but it's also the wind is also moving the sand dunes. And the sand dunes are another challenge that we saw over the past year, that sand dunes are refilling the canal, because the canal is basically not protecting the soil, which is they are excavating from the canal. The soil is not protected. They are not vegetated back, not stabilized by any sort of, for example, oil mulching or any lime mulching, which is commonly practiced. Soil is commonly loose, and the soil is transported back into the canal. And we saw that because the soil under the sun, due to the photofixation, there's a lot of nutrients fixed into the soil particles or the sand particles. And when this sand is finding its way back into the canal due to the eutrophication, basically while the weed is growing inside the canal, we saw that in the first phase of the canal, large region was full of wild weed and wild weeds. And weed is something that undesired inside the canal, because weed is basically blocking water flow. And basically when it blocks water flow, the bottom of the canal come up and the water cannot reach the down part of the canal, and the sediments are basically blocked into the first part of the canal. So another challenge when we are talking about sediments is the intake structure. You see at the beginning of the canal, there is an infrastructure basically which guides water from Amudarya into the canal. And if you look at the other Soviet era canals, for example, Karakum Canal has a reservoir, a big dam at the beginning of the canal, where all the sediment from Amudarya is basically dumped there, and basically relatively clean water is basically guided into the canal in order to avoid sedimentation of the canal. Why sedimentation is not desired? Because sedimentation leads to the canal filling. Over time, the canal bed will come up, And when the canal bed is coming up, basically the water is not freely flowing into the canal, or the capacity of the canal would be limited. That's basically lacking for Qoshtepa, because Qoshtepa has no desiltation mechanism or no sort of dam or reservoir to reduce the sediments. And Amu Darya is basically, in each cubic meter of water, there is about 10 kilogram of sediments. It's about 4 to 10 times more sediments than Nile River. So it is a huge amount of sediments throughout the year. So this is another issue, which I think in the future, even if the canal is operationalized, if we are not taking any sort of technical measure to reduce the sediment will gradually fill up the bottom of the canal, and that will lead to a point that the water will not flow to the end of the canal, in particular during the late summer, when the water levels in the Amu Darya River is coming down. So this is another issue. I think the environmental challenges I already mentioned about salinization, dust storms, but there is another aspect that we have to take into our consideration. That's on agricultural practices in North Afghanistan. Agriculture is basically very inefficient in Afghanistan. Even compared to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, the agriculture in Afghanistan is not practiced well in terms of the variety of the cropping that's nowadays available. The variety of cottons, for example, there is much better variety available in Uzbekistan compared to Afghanistan, which is very water intensive. And also the irrigation is almost the furrow irrigation type, which is lacking this sort of modern irrigation, which saves water. The irrigation technology which is used or practiced in Afghanistan basically wastes a lot of water. About 70% of water is wasted. So another focus should be here also on agriculture. What we will make, even if the canal is a successful project, but what the agriculture practices and the cropping technology should be up to date. It should be improved in order to basically to have the whole project as a success project, regardless of whether the canal itself will function or not. We will see in the future. But the messages here maybe that if the cost of no action would be much higher, I think, for the Central Asia as a whole, because if the canal is moving forward with the current condition, with the current quality, that will, of course, would be devastating. I think maybe exaggerated, but that would not be good for the region, because the water would be wasted, but also not for the downstream only Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, but also for Afghanistan themselves, because of the soil salinity that will appear and the other challenges that I mentioned. So I think a collective effort is required here. Experience sharing with Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, with Afghanistan is required. I think the more efficient the canal is, the better water would be available for the downstream as well, and for the Aral Basin as a whole. Thank you very much.
Well, that adds a new aspect to the discussion. All three presentations I thought were informative and incisive. Now we have not just three panelists, but a discussant, Professor Erica Weinthal from Duke University. Could you give us your thoughts on what we've just heard?
Yeah, thank you, especially to the Center for National Interest and Andy for inviting me to participate. I will note I've had a long history in working in the region. I did my dissertation in the 1990s on the Aral Sea Basin. And so when I hear these, presentations about what's happening in Afghanistan, what I think about immediately is the continuity. There's so many of these issues that have been continuing for decades that haven't been fully addressed. And then the importance of governance and institutions, and that we really need to dig into finding ways to bring all the riparians together to address water management in the region. I just want to start, though, with two quotes from when I was writing my book on the Aral Sea, which I think in some ways are still illustrative of the challenges facing the countries in the region. And I will note from the slides that Elvira had, in 1992, there was a lot more water than there was today, and people still had hope that one could manage the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, the two main rivers that flow into the RLC, in a way that would provide water for all the users and also provide water for the RLC. So really taking into account the multiple needs of those in the basin. And one of the quotes that I started with was from a poet, Muhammad Salih, who said, "You cannot fill the Aral with tears." So we can't sit around and just talk about the problems. We really need to find action and concrete solutions. And I think this is what all the panelists or presenters today have been talking about, is we need to find new ways of engagement, especially engaging Afghanistan now in the management of the rivers that ultimately flow into the terminal lake, which is the RLC. But the other was from Yusuf Kamalov, who was the director of an NGO at the time, the Union for the Defense of the RLC and the Amu Darya, who said control over water is power in Central Asia. So those that control the upper reaches of a river really have the ability to exert leverage, influence, power in the basin. And those power asymmetries have been changing over time. And they changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union with the creation of the newly independent states, where Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were able to exert greater influence on the upper reaches of the RLC basin, and now Afghanistan with the construction of the Qoshtepa Canal. There are a few themes that I think are really important for understanding the canal within the entire basin. And this has to do with, when we talk about the RLC, this isn't an environmental disaster that had to happen. This is man-made. It was created by decisions about how to use and allocate water. And I think we're hearing that in the presentations today about water was siphoned off for cotton monoculture in the region. Cotton still is one of the main users of water. The construction of canals that were unlined led to high rates of evaporation, which we're seeing now, which we heard from Najibullah with the Qoshtepa Canal, like similar types of design of infrastructure, and also salinization of the soil. So this is something that is a disaster that is tied to the Soviet legacy, which still continues in many ways, this continuity of canal construction. And then I think also what's really important to understand is that this is a region that has been affected by war and conflict. And for about 40 years, there was very little data on water, water management, water infrastructure in Afghanistan. This report is really important because it's one of the first reports in decades to come out since the World Bank produced a report in 2004 on the Amu Darya. So this is really critical to restart these conversations about Afghanistan within the context of managing these major rivers within Central Asia, and bringing attention to the need for data to manage the river. But it's also about reconstruction and rebuilding infrastructure, and doing it in ways that need to be more climate sensitive, because of the massive impacts of climate change, as these are rivers that are glacier fed. And so maybe how do you infuse capital to invest in infrastructure that may not be mimicking what was built during the Soviet era. And this comes back to right now, this is being self-funded by the government in Afghanistan. It is not, you don't see major donors who can come in and leverage influence on the construction of the canal. And then, another major theme, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and you can tell me when I should also stop at some point, is governance and institutions, because all of this is what's necessary for managing the canal, but also needs for broader participation. Elvira talked about the agreements that took place after the Soviet Union collapsed, which were many, and everybody assumed there would be conflict at that time, and there wasn't conflict. The states came together essentially not to save the RLC in the end, but to prevent conflict and manage waters that were for their best interest. And Afghanistan was not included at that time, and that was deliberate. And just because it was easier to manage the 5 states because they knew each other and they basically recreated or reconstituted agreements that existed under the Soviet Union, but in new terms. But what is really important to recognize, agreements are never static, and they need to change, they need to evolve. And this has had to happen too in Central Asia because the upstream countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, have built new dams and new infrastructure. In Tajikistan, they're building the Rogun Dam, which will also influence the Amudarya, and you can't overlook that. Because, as Andy also mentioned, this is a region in the north that has a population that needs, their needs need to be addressed. They have, to be address the economic needs of the population. And this has been the case in many other river basins. And so I think the Afghan case can also learn from other basins, because what we're seeing are some similarities to the Nile Basin, where you had an agreement that existed for decades between Sudan and Egypt, and then you have Ethiopia exerting its power to build the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is changing the dynamics in the Nile Basin, so the need to renegotiate. And this will likely be the same case for managing the waters in Central Asia. And also the Central Asian states have recognized this. President Karimov at the time was very much opposed to the Rogun Dam in Tajikistan, but as of June 2022, there is an agreement between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan where Uzbekistan has committed to buying energy from Tajikistan. What I think is interesting is that a lot of these agreements that have been mentioned today are bilateral. So we're seeing a lot more emergence of bilateral agreements rather than a multilateral agreement. And this is something I think that, if you really fully want to manage an entire river basin, it needs to be multilateral, but sometimes states like the bilateral agreements because it allows them to, exert power in very limited ways rather than bringing everyone in. I think the bottom line, what we're hearing today, is that there is a need to update the agreements to engage Afghanistan in many ways because of the needs of reconstruction. One cannot overlook this, that Afghanistan will move ahead with water infrastructure. The legacy of the various, the war starting with the Soviet-Afghan War has led to devastation of the Kharez system, the traditional irrigation systems in Afghanistan. There has been massive digging of wells throughout Afghanistan. There's a need for better, data management, data collection, dealing with the pressures of climate change, and recognizing too that in the long term, in the long duration, Afghanistan won't be able to do this by itself. And so the US can play a role, the other multilateral development banks may be able to play a role. When it came to the Rogun Dam in Tajikistan, what is striking there is the range of actors that have been involved in providing loans, for example, everyone from the European Investment Bank to the World Bank to the Islamic Development Bank to the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And so there's going to be this balancing in the region, which, no one has mentioned China yet. No one has mentioned Russia, but Russia has still troops in Tajikistan. There is a range of actors in the region who will want to have influence, both in Central Asia and in Afghanistan, and the environment and water has often served as that entry point. And so this is, I think one of the things that, people are going to be needing to consider how basic infrastructure serves broader geopolitical goals. And I think that comes out in the report that wasn't emphasized enough in the discussion today in the presentations. But I think that is one of the highlights of the report. The last point I want to say, because I think this is, is when we talk about governance and institutions, if you saw the picture, and this is common in many of these discussions, it's the 5 heads of states in Central Asia that signed the agreements. They were all men. There has been some really interesting dynamics taking place in Central Asia. It's tied to this women in water diplomacy, where you have a lot of women who are engaged in water management and water diplomacy in the region. And I think bringing in more stakeholders and broadening the number of people who can participate in the design of these institutions will be incredibly valuable, because you will have more voices in the room, and then also having more voices in the room in thinking about the environmental impacts and accountability for not only managing the canal itself, the Qoshtepa Canal, but also maybe one day revisiting and thinking about the implications for the Aral Sea, which is the farthest downstream. So I will stop there, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you very much. I think we have enough time, and we have a lot of interested viewers still, if my screen summary is accurate. So I was wondering if each of our panelists wanted to talk with a brief response for, say, 1 to 2 minutes. Andy, do you want to kick it off?
Look, I'm a political scientist, like Erica, and water security in Central Asia and Afghanistan is a common goods problem from hell. And intellectually, it's quite fascinating to look at all the various aspects to it. But what really struck me when I got into this in the past year is that we're approaching a tipping point, I think, for water in Central Asia, where the potential for catastrophic outcomes are increasing, and the trend lines of actions have been completely insufficient. I think, noting all of the awareness of the problems of the Aral Sea going back to, well, decades, and the failure. Well, it's true. Erica's right. There hasn't been a war over water, and actually wars over water are quite rare. As a result of, I still look at this as an epic fail. The amount of water available is less, the quality of the water is less, and if collective action is not taken in a wise and far-sighted way, then you think about the potential downsides, and they're quite large. We didn't pay adequate attention to this part of the world in the 1990s, and the result of 2009, 9/11, 2001, et cetera. So I think there is a catch here for U.S. foreign policy, and I have to admit I have a soft spot for Afghanistan. The first time I went to the Soviet Union was 2 days after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I had about 10% of my student body when I was president of the American University of Central Asia were Afghans, and they were remarkable students. And to see the condition of the country, this project represents a real ray of hope in some ways, but in particular, what Elvira and Najib had to say about the current construction of the canal is that it actually may exacerbate things for everybody. And the time for entry point of others is the window is closing, and the importance of the United States is that it can help to unlock, I think, some of the multilateral financial institutions, the World Bank, the EBRD, the Asian Development Bank, and others. And I think, as Erica suggested, the example of the Rogun Dam, where many players have gotten involved. And I think that many other players could get involved here. And we don't have, and maybe Najib will want to say more about this. We've had no indications, actually, that the de facto authorities in Kabul are opposed to international support for this. And actually, if you think about it from the standpoint of the Afghans suffer from a real lack of local expertise on this. And so I think that they could stand to benefit relatively more from having more international engagement on the project than even Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. So I'll stop there.
I have a question that one of our viewers has posed, which I think is kind of interesting. And I'll direct it to Najib and Elvira. Elvira can go first. The question really is, what are the chances of this canal ever being successfully completed? Is that, and I think there's some skepticism inherent in that question. Elvira, you go first.
Well, I know that the Afghan government is giving many comments on regarding the timing of completion of this canal, and I guess Najib will answer this question more broadly because I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but we're talking about the minimum five years and maybe more.
Well, thank you
Najib,
very much.
what's your take? Do you think they're actually capable of pulling this off?
Well, at the moment, I mean, look, first I want to just mention that Afghans are very hopeful that the canal will bring them some prosperity, and everybody is basically celebrating this canal across Afghanistan. But common people are not aware of detailed technical issues that are there. So, but now, if you look at the canal itself, at the moment, only the focus is on the main canal. So basically, the main canal is basically dug. But there are a lot of sub-canals, branch canals, drainage canals, and hydraulic infrastructures that are not yet started. So I'm not sure where what the budget for the rest of the canal will come, because for the main canal, there was official numbers say that they are coming. The budget is coming from selling Balkhab coal mine and coal export to Pakistan. But now we see that over the last year that the coal export has drastically reduced to Pakistan, and I'm not sure where would the money come for the rest of the project. First, from the financial point of view. The second is that, of course, we see that challenges are felt within the de facto authority as well as we move forward with the construction of the canal. We saw that for example, the eutrophication inside the canal, the growth of the weeds inside the canal, they were all some sort of alarming for them. I think that they are slowly realizing that the canal project is not a very easy one. It has a complex components which has to be considered. And I think in terms of operationalizing, as soon as the intake infrastructure is completed, that should happen next year, as the officials say, because it's 60% work is completed. The main canal will be filled by water, or can be filled by water, but that doesn't mean that the water is used for agriculture, because you only fill a long canal, 287 kilometers with water, but there is no sub canals to distribute the water on agricultural land, because agriculture requires land preparation, and that land preparation means that it takes years to complete, because there are sand dunes, there are you need the canals, small canals to bring water to the field. In some places you need solar powered pumping to pump water from the sub canals onto the agricultural field. That's why I think that feasibility study also rightly say that it will take 15 years, up to 15 years, to, even if everything goes in the right direction and continuously moving, it will take 1.5 decades to really use water from Amudarya. But in the meantime, of course, filling the canal is also water usage. At least you will waste 22% in the first 40 kilometers, and the rest would be evaporation loss, which you will have. But that doesn't mean that the water is used for agriculture.
We have another very tough question directed at the report. Maybe I'll start with Professor Weinthal, since she is our discussant, and I'll just read the question. It's from Charity Watson, who asks, how do you plan to advocate in donor capitals for the engagement position you've recommended in the report, when there are many, both inside governments and in the Afghan diaspora, advocating for the very opposite. They want isolation of the Taliban or even direct opposition. And all this at a moment when aid financing for Afghanistan is on decline, and few are even considering small infrastructure. So she's questioning the engagement position in the report.
I'm
Professor
gonna
Wanto, do you want to
yeah,
tackle that first, and then we'll go to some of the panelists?
yeah. I mean, I'll let Andy tackle it since it's the recommendation in the report. I mean, if you're
I
gonna
wonder if you're
manage,
skeptical of it as well, that's all.
I mean, I recognize the challenges of you know, dealing with governments that have, human rights violations that may not allow for the inclusion of all stakeholders. But if you want to manage a water system well, everybody has to be at the table. And otherwise, it can lead, it will continue to contribute to bad management practices. And it may be that this needs to be done under, the auspices of, the international community, but also this is an opportunity to maybe use some of the leverage that will be needed for funding to really include all stakeholders at the table, because this is definitely a regional canal that will affect, like a regional canal within Afghanistan that will affect five, or three other countries downstream. And so how do you then, you know, use the leverage that international donors may have to address some of the concerns that the international community may have?
Andy, you're next.
Well, anything worth doing is never going to be easy. Otherwise, a lot of people would have done it, right? Look, the challenges are immense. I mean, my argument to U.S. authorities would be, okay, look, the downside risks of this, of water security leading to major governance problems and instability throughout the region are significant enough to justify engagement. And I use the comparison with the notion that the late Ash Carter and Bill Perry wrote about in their book Preventive Defense, where the risk of significant damage to stability regionally, and even possibly more larger than regionally, is such that you make an investment in cooperation earlier then maybe you can alleviate huge costs down the road. As far as the Taliban goes, okay, yes, we're all familiar with the defects of their governance in Afghanistan, but the fact is they are the de facto authorities, and I don't think they're going anywhere particularly soon. And the urgency of this problem is such that you have to start with them. And it just to emphasize, I think that where we need to get to is exactly what Erica is saying, is that where there is a broad coalition of players, including the Gulf states, including China, including the multilateral financial institutions to engage here. And in the near term, we are not asking the U.S. government to fund anything. I think it would be a total non-starter to go to the U.S. Congress to support something that could actually help the Taliban. But at the minimum ask is that we don't seek to block this, and that sort of provide a green light, an implicit green light for the multilaterals where we have influence to engage, and really the less that is said in Washington about it, the better. I see a lot of this is sort of behind the scenes diplomacy that would be required in the beginning just to kind of break the ice.
Final question, which one of our viewers also posed, and I was wondering about, is where are the Taliban raising the cash for such an expensive project if it is not, if you're saying it's self-funded and it's not being paid for by, say, China, where are they getting the money from?
Well, so far it's been from the coal exports to Pakistan that I think Najib referred to earlier. And another thing to keep in mind is that your dollar goes a much longer way in Afghanistan than in other places. I think the domestic political will and the political capital investment that the Taliban has made in this project, it's a very high profile project, very high profile, and the public relations behind it is quite interesting to study. But they are betting a lot of political capital on the success of this project, and so at the rate that it's costing so far, I think they can manage that, but we'll see.
I was assuming they did not invest in Bitcoin, which just hit 100,000 today. Well, I can tell this subject actually is kind of a hornet's nest from the amount of responses that we have garnered on the website and the intense numbers of viewers that we have. But we have gone over our usual time limit. So unless anyone wants to make a final statement, I think we'll end it here.